Dr. Alexander, welcome back to Austin.
Well, thanks, Bob. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. I serve as the president for the Institute for Neuroscience and Consciousness Studies. Our primary mission is to study human consciousness in all its forms, but especially some of those exceptional human abilities that you go into in some of your books. Mm-hmm. We wanted to try to understand those and educate the public about them, but then also extend beyond that to try to understand what do those tell us about human consciousness and the nature of reality. So that's been our mission, and in a way you are the perfect person to address some of those questions. Some of the forms of human consciousness that we've been fascinated with and had a lot of presentations about over the years are things like near-death experience, remote viewing, after-death communication, OBEs, out-of-body experience. Mm-hmm. But I'd like to hear more from you about you having had such a vivid and memorable near-death experience that changed your life so profoundly, and then studied a lot of these other forms of consciousness. I wanted to hear more from you about how you see these experiences, what they can tell us about consciousness, the nature of consciousness, and about the nature of reality.
Well, that's an excellent question. I would say one thing that became clear to me, 2 to 3 months after my coma, when all my memories and knowledge had returned, but I was more perplexed than ever in trying to understand how that kind of damage to my brain could have opened up such a robust kind of ultra-reality of conscious experience. So I started realizing that our conventional view of consciousness, being created by the brain, is clearly very wrong. And so part of that whole conventional thinking is that we can only know things through the ken of our physical senses. What I can see with my eyes, what I can hear with my ears. And yet the reality is we know from other kind of scientific work, say for example in remote viewing, the psychic spy programs, and remote viewing in general, the ability to discern information at a distance is something that's available to all humans, beyond the ken of our eyes and ears, that there are channels of information that go far beyond that. And these are all kind of examples of what I call non-local consciousness. And non-local not only means not here spatially, but not here temporally. Remote viewing can be done, past, future. The clock of kind of the material world does not necessarily limit the kinds of information flow available there. And then when you look at other examples, say out-of-body experiences, people can have very profound experiences. Some of the scientific study shows that they can actually have a presence manifest at a distant location, distant from their body. And yet, how do we make sense of all this? Then there's the whole category of what's called precognition. The work of Daryl Bem, incredible work showing how in many ways we can feel the future. That humans, the average normal human, not some special empath or something, but all of us can demonstrate abilities of knowing the future before it happens. And in fact, when you read the results of those experiments, and especially the meta-analysis that Bem did later on when challenged by materialist scientists about it, you realize we really don't understand much about this thing called consciousness at all. But to pretend that it's limited to the physical brain and body is just not so. It doesn't fit the data. You look at things like telepathy. Guillaume Playfair wrote a beautiful book on twin telepathy, where he basically determined that 35% of identical twins have a strong form of telepathy, where, for example, if one of them touches a hot stove, the other twin, who could be 1,000 miles away, can feel pain and develop a blister. Now, how does that happen? And these are scientifically validated. It's not like you can say, oh, that can't be, it's not true. No, they are. This is real empirical data about the reality of non-local consciousness. So clearly we're on the wrong pathway to think that the brain is creating consciousness de novo out of the material matter, 2.5 pound gelatinous mass sitting in my skull. So we just need a much bigger vision of what consciousness is and how it intersects with our human awareness, how it interacts with this material world, but then what are our chances of influencing that world? The conventional materialist neuroscience would try and tell you that we don't even have free will, that it's all chemical reactions, electron fluxes in the brain, an illusion of conscious awareness, but they say pay it no mind. Well, I can say differently, no, pay it a lot of mind, because mind is fundamental. Consciousness is fundamental. It's not our little egotistical consciousness. That's the piece that I think is important to point out. The little voice in our head is a little more than a parlor trick. You have about that much brain devoted to generating speech and another piece of brain about the same size that is receptive for speech. And yet those pieces and the way we treat language in our world is so powerful that we say, yes, this is the dominant hemisphere. This is where my speech lives. Well, I would urge people to follow Michael Singer's vision, in his book, The Untethered Soul. He calls that linguistic voice in the head, the voice of the ego, he calls it your annoying roommate. And that's a beautiful way to put it. And so in meditation, I try to meditate an hour or two a day. I've been doing that for more than a decade now. And the very first thing I do in meditation is I let that little linguistic brain state a request or ask a question of the universe. But then that little voice of anxiety and fear goes into timeout. Because there is far greater wisdom, especially as you learn to identify with your conscious awareness as who you truly are, and not that pesky little egotistical voice in your head, because that is not your consciousness.
Well, that's very well put, and I think you touched on meditation, and from reading your book, you talked a fair amount about the sound meditation
right.
you do. Is that your typical meditation that you tend to go to?
It is, and I want to stress that for me, any form of meditation is properly described as a form of centering prayer. Centering prayer is kind of a non-supplicative form of prayer in which one asks for thy will, not mine, be done, basically opening up to the benevolence of the universe to allow the best possible outcome for all involved. And for me, as I said, I meditate, centering prayer, an hour or two a day. And it's important to point out that the sounds of sacred acoustics, which is what you're talking about, and people can learn a lot more at sacredacoustics.com, but the point I want to make is that differential frequency brain entrainment, using slightly different sound frequencies to the two ears, was recognized almost 200 years ago as a powerful kind of effector of consciousness. Wilhelm Heinrich Dove, a Prussian physicist, discovered that binaural beat effect back in the mid-19th century. And it was in the 20th century where people like Bob Monroe, who was interested in out-of-body experiences, found that differential frequency sound could greatly enhance out-of-body experiences. Likewise, people in remote viewing programs found that remote viewing could be enhanced through differential frequency sound. And what I would say to try and explain that without going into too much detail is that most of the sounds you've ever heard, and this certainly includes all the chants, anthems, hymns that might have helped to engender a transcendental state of conscious awareness in a spiritual setting, all of those sounds are processed in the neocortex, in the acoustic cortex of the temporal lobe, in circuits that have arisen in the last 1 to 10 million years. So they're very recent. Now, the difference in differential frequency brain entrainment, we believe, is that these slight differences in frequency discovered 200 years ago influence a circuit in the lower brainstem, the superior olivary nucleus complex, which influences the ascending electrical signals from the lower brainstem. And these are circuits that arose more than 300 million years ago. And I believe there's a general principle in evolutionary biology that if you really want to understand a function, an anatomy, the certain part of something you're interested in, follow its evolution back to its origins. And when you do that with the brain and all the mechanisms we think in the brain that are related to consciousness, you find that by intercepting consciousness at this very primitive level in the lower brainstem, in a circuit that arose before mammals existed on Earth. In fact, it was originally a localization system, and it still works. I hear a sound behind my head, and that circuit, superior olivary nucleus, calculates the arrival time of sound going 1,000 feet per second to my two ears and then tells me where the sound is. So it measures sound down to tens of microseconds, a very accurate timer. And so by using this differential frequency effect, as you find in sacred acoustics, you find that it can liberate conscious awareness and set you free. When I'm in the deepest levels of a sound journey, I'm not even hearing the tones anymore. They're long gone from my awareness, but my awareness has now been set free, is no longer stuck in this here and now in this false sense of self, but it's out in the realm of consciousness, of something we can all explore. And this is a point I often make, is you don't have to have a near-death experience to understand everything I know about these realms. If you use powerful tools like sacred acoustics for exploring consciousness, you end up making a lot of these discoveries on your own, because it is a powerful liberator of conscious awareness to get you out of the here and now, and especially away from that false thinking, the little voice in your head, your voice of your ego, is who you are, your consciousness. That's not true at all. The magic of consciousness is your awareness of existence, and that's the piece that you can really grow tremendously with these techniques.
That's very helpful. And I know you mentioned in there the use of some of these sound technologies for out-of-body experience. I've had a few what I believe would be considered out-of-body experiences. They haven't been the super vivid traveling versions, but more like one of Bob Monroe's earlier ones, where you just kind of, at night, you just wake up right next to the ceiling.
Right, and realize you're out.
So I've been always fascinated about the relationship to the out-of-body experience to the near-death experience, such as you had. How do you see the similarities and differences there?
What I see is that what we're calling consciousness is something that certainly involves and expresses this material realm for us, but it has many layers, and those layers go all the way back to what to me would be the origin of all that is, a layer of infinite dimensional space and of all of eternity that is its true home. And that I see that we then have a parcellation out as you move from that core realm, as I experienced it, of oneness with that divine creative force. As we move out into various levels of the universe, we see more and more the expressions of consciousness that then manifest in these various scenes and assemblies and what have you. So there are multiple layers. But then in a practical sense, we encounter those. I would say that those spiritual realms are something we easily encounter in dreams, for example. And it's certainly the realm of the near-death experience. It's the realm where we reunite with higher soul, when we leave the brain and body once and for all, where we reunite with souls of departed loved ones, where we end up going through plans for the next incarnation, because I fully believe that the scientific evidence for reincarnation is so strong, you'd have to be a fool to just reject it. But unfortunately, there are plenty of willfully ignorant fools out there who claim to have a statement about all this, but have not reviewed the scientific data. And to me, that's a very unscientific approach. But this is really about learning as much as we can about how sleep, how psychedelic states, I think, show a tremendous amount of information of those realms. The near-death experience, absolutely, and shared death. It's important for people to realize, if they don't, that you can have near-death experiences even when you don't have something that brings you close to death. And very commonly it's described with people who are at the bedside of a loved one who's leaving the physical world. And I heard many of these reports from people early on when I was giving my talks about my experience, but I had no idea what they were talking about because they weren't near death. And it's called a shared death experience. And Raymond Moody actually wrote a book about these called Glimpses of Eternity. I think that book came out in about 2011. But shared death experiences are just like NDEs, but they occur in people who are generally physiologically normal and healthy, like someone at the bedside of a loved one who's dying. But, you know, in those realms, time and space are not as limiting as they are in the physical world. So you could be 1,000 miles away, and if your mother is leaving this world, her soul might pass through and drag your soul along for the journey. And people will have a shared death experience, even to the point of seeing a full-blown life review of the departing soul, and then they come back to this world. And of course, when they do, they realize death is not the end at all. So shared death experiences are just another part of the tip of the spear to educate this world to a much grander form of reality where consciousness is fundamental.
Very good. Almost on the borderline between what we could call an out-of-body experience and a near-death experience, somewhere in between.
Well, I think, yeah, and a lot of near-death experiences do involve some element of out-of-body. I mean, I was out of the universe, but that counts as out-of-body. But yeah, the out-of-body experience, I think there's a lot of overlap in some of these things. And that's why lucid dreaming, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences, after-death communications, NDE, near-death experiences, shared death experiences, psychedelic drug work, and some of the interesting scientific evidence there shows us very clearly the surprise to materialist neuroscientists is in study after study after study, looking at psilocybin, LSD, dimethyltryptamine, other psychedelic drugs that influence the neocortex. What you find is that the brain goes dark. You know, anybody who's ever taken one of those drugs will probably assume, oh, the brain must light up like a Christmas tree. Well, no, it doesn't, because the brain is not generating that experience. It's getting out of the way for you to have the experience. And so in fact, in these studies, the shocking thing is no part of the brain has an increase in activity. The whole brain gets out of the way. And I know when I first read one of those papers from Imperial College of London in 2012, I was so blown away because it mimicked exactly what I experienced in my near-death experience. You know, by taking my whole neocortex offline with this devastating gram-negative bacterial E. coli infection, I was given just a beautiful journey through those spiritual realms that was not dependent on my brain at all, other than the fact that my brain had to get out of the way. But it's one of the reasons why I'm very attracted to sacred acoustics and binaural beats, because I believe that they similarly offer us a way to get the brain out of the way, to take it offline. And that's what allows our conscious awareness to roam so freely in that kind of meditative state.
I see, yes, and you mentioned dreaming. I studied dreaming and lucid dreaming in the sleep lab for many years. One of the things that struck me is so many folks would tell me, I don't dream, I don't remember any dreams. And of course we know that from scientific studies and REM studies that indeed everyone, or almost virtually everyone, dreams every night. But yet they don't recall them.
Right.
So it brought up questions in me related to near-death experience. You had such a vivid and memorable experience, super real or more real than everyday reality. You mentioned in your book that somewhere between 15 and 20% of people who experience near death in the sense of a coma, or they're very close to death, or sometimes even clinical death. Why do you think only that percentage, 15 or 20%, actually come back and remember something, whereas others seem to have no memory of it, such as Alicia had described.
Right. Well, that's a very good question. And generally in the medical literature, the numbers are somewhere between 15 and 25% that actually come close to death and then come back with these kind of memories of this kind of experience. And one would naturally wonder, well, why not 100%? What's going on there? I don't know that I have an answer to that other than to say that I do believe that there's a very active system of what I call programmed forgetting. So just as we were talking minutes ago about the dream world and how people come back and say, well, I don't dream. Well, the scientific analysis would say, yes, you do dream, you just don't remember them. And likewise, in the discussion about past life memories in children, go to University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. Ian Stevens and Jim Tucker, they've studied more than 2,500 cases over the last 6 decades. Past life memories in children, indicative of reincarnation. Very strong cases, surprising. I mean, we really need to entertain reincarnation as an absolute reality. And yet, what those scientists will tell you is after about age 5 or 6, those memories go away very rapidly. And especially in our culture, you know, if a child is talking about, oh, I was playing with Mama out in the side yard, and the parent says, but you don't even know your Mama. She died before you were born, your grandmother. How could you even know we call her that? That's who she was playing with. And but those memories go away very quickly. You know, by age 5 or 6, they're pretty much deleted, just like those memories from dreams. We know dreaming and sleep is very important, not just in humans, but in many animals going way down the evolutionary chain. You take away sleep and dreaming, it can be fatal over a few weeks. And yet we usually don't remember the content. Why is that? I don't know. I'm not sure I have an answer right now. Why is it that we would glean things from those spiritual realms in dreams or in a near-death experience that we then don't really have access to remember in this world? And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that some of that is to be that kind of tuned in and aware of things beyond the here and now might not necessarily give you a survival advantage. You know, that in the predator-prey dance, that potentially being more kind of focused on a here and now situation as opposed to something that is as much unrooted from the here and now and from the what's necessary for a biological organism to survive. I'm not sure I have an answer, but I do believe that there is this process of program forgetting, and that certain aspects of that knowledge are to be brought back. I think it is interesting, though, that in near-death experiences, in many ways, are kind of an exception that prove the rule. And we've had dreams around for all of the history of humanity, etc. But for much of our history, our religious systems and this kind of adventure into spiritual realms usually ended up being associated with actually dying. And then in the late 1960s, medical scientists developed techniques of cardiac resuscitation, which meant that we shifted that whole balance. And so since the late 60s, with these techniques, we've now populated the world with tens of millions of souls who have been to the other side and then come back. Now, they don't all remember it, or they certainly don't all talk about it, because I promise you, it's a very shocking thing to go through. The ultra-reality is kind of mind-bending, especially to the materialist who expects that as their brain goes out, they're just going to dim down to nothingness. And when the exact opposite happens, it is a great surprise. And I will say that I think that the number that, you know, from the literature, that 15 to 25% number, is in many ways artificially low, because I think many people still are so worried they're going to think that people will take them as crazy if they start talking about that story, that they don't want to talk about it. And that was one of the reasons why I felt like getting proof of heaven out there was, you know, an important part of my mission. You know, to take the lid off, because once the medical profession, nurses and doctors, and I will credit the nurses, they get this better than many of people like me, some of us physician colleagues who are a little slow on the uptake. The nurses are more commonly there when somebody passes over. And many nurses tried to teach me these deep truths of, you know, eternity of soul back when I was at Harvard, but I was not necessarily listening to my patients and some of what my nurses would tell me. But We all are getting it in increasing numbers now, and by taking the lid off for the medical profession, that helps to take the lid off for all of us. The more we can share these stories, and these are a real part of humanity. That's one of the things I love about my job. I get to go around the world talking to naive audiences who may have never heard of this stuff before. And I'll have many people come up afterwards and say, I've never told anybody this before, but, and then they share some profound experience, a near-death or shared-death experience. It might have happened many decades earlier. And they all say, I remember it as if it happened yesterday. Because these things change your life. They're absolutely real. We need to understand them more deeply to understand this universe we live in.
We're learning so much, and you've discussed many things about quantum physics and the experiments that have shaken up the scientific world over the last 30 or more years. Mm-hmm. Those experiments, and then some of these exceptional and not fully understood human abilities, do you think that science is capable of studying them in a way that can reveal some of how these things are possible and what they can tell us about human consciousness and reality? Or is science really incapable of bridging that gap and being able to really say anything or set up experiments that can really get at the fundamental nature of these?
Well, I love that quote from Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work in quantum physics back in the early 60s. But he said that in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he said there's a tremendous amount of truth that will never be demonstrated with the scientific method. That's essentially what I'm paraphrasing there, but that's essentially what he was saying, that there's a tremendous amount of knowledge that cannot be neatly compartmentalized into, a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. We need to take the anecdotes, the many millions of stories that the universe gives us in the form of human experience, and we need to glean from those anecdotes, the truth of what they're trying to tell us. Now, this doesn't mean the scientific method isn't useful. It's very useful. In fact, I would say, as an example, look at all those papers coming out about the psychedelic drugs that confirm over and over and over again, the brain goes dark. The brain is not doing this. Whatever you're experiencing on those drugs is because the brain is actually getting out of the way. And that is something that scientific techniques like functional MRI and magnetoencephalography can help us to come to fully realize. I think the important thing is to remember that our explanatory systems are not limited by the simplistic and bleak, paltry falsehoods of materialist or physicalist thought. So we need to open our minds tremendously, but certainly science, I think, can weigh in tremendously to help us come to a deeper understanding of this. And quantum physics is a beautiful example, because who would ever think that by studying the subatomic particles that make up this world around us, that you would start discovering very profound evidence that your very conscious awareness is not something being generated by your brain, but in fact is part of the universe. And that humans actually have a way of connecting to the mental layer of the universe. But that's not to say that conscious awareness is something that is fundamentally human. We actually borrow that from the universe. And this is where I think the scientific method opens up tremendously, because to try and explain the findings of quantum physics, you can resort to what is the most popular interpretation of the measurement paradox in the world of physicists today, which is the many worlds interpretation that Hugh Everett came up with in 1957, where every possible subatomic observation leads to a new universe. Well, if you're comfortable with that, have fun. To me, there's one universe, and it's much better understood by understanding that mind is primary, that all of physical reality emerges from the mental layer of assimilation and integration of information in this universe. That's what we are discovering. And for those who want to say, oh, that's all a bunch of supernatural nonsense, I will point out consciousness is part of the natural world. we're only talking about the natural world. But if you want to understand consciousness, you must realize that there's a certain level of understanding and of information exchange that we participate in that goes far beyond the simplistic belief that the physical brain is creating consciousness locally and temporally now, independent of access to a tremendous amount of information about the universe. So we have access to that. And science can actually help us tremendously in this journey of discovery of human potential, which I think is falsely limited by the beliefs of materialist science that in so many ways kind of restrict and limit us to things that have nothing to do with our real potential.
Wow, thank you. I love that way of conceptualizing it, and
I think it makes sense.
Looking at the more simpler explanation, even if it goes against some of our preconceived notions.
Right.
So, yeah, I just want to say that I know we've just barely touched the surface here. Of course, you have many more videos, and your books are available, as well as your sound meditations. So, hoping to have you back to Austin sometime in the next year or so, maybe.
Well, we'd love to come back, and hopefully next time I can bring Karen. I think you'll find she is the best half of this couple, and anyone who wants to learn more can go to sacredacoustics.com. I would encourage people to go to ebenalexander.com and take the free 33-day email course that's available right on that website. Just leave your first name and an email address, and you're off and running. More than 8,000 people around the world have taken that 33-day course. And it has a translate button, so people from all over the world are helping each other, sharing their own experiences, leaving a tremendous amount of information. And I must say I found it very heartening that a number of very militant atheists have come through that site. And by the end of those 33 days, they say, well, of course, God is very real. Now I get it. And they can see how God and afterlife and reincarnation fit into a modern, scientifically informed vision of reality. So it's something to really wake this world up and share with everyone.
Wow. You're really opening a lot of eyes and a lot of minds and a lot of hearts, too.
Well, it's all about heart consciousness. Karen taught me that, and we expand on that in innersanctumcenter.com, which is another program that Karen came up with. But hopefully we can come back to Austin, and I'd love to bring Karen next time.
Excellent. We would love
that would be
well.
fantastic.
Okay, thank you.
Well, great.